Hi, and welcome to our podcast on tenants and energy efficiency in buildings. With me, I have Andrew deCoriolis, Director of Engagement at Lucid. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Sure. Lucid is a 7-year-old software company, and we started actually in a college and university at Oberlin College in Ohio. It's sort of the center part of the United States. The goal at the time was to use what was this very high-performance building called the Adam Joseph Lewis Center for Environmental Studies as a living laboratory. It was the sort of first modern green building on a college campus and had a lot of data flowing through it about solar panels and geothermal wells and renewable sort of wastewater systems in the building, but very little happening in terms of transparency or occupant engagement. People who, studied or worked in the building had very little idea about, those high performance features or how their behavior influenced the building's performance. So Lucid started as a student research project, really, trying to understand how we can both collect and display data, high performance data within buildings, and then how we can make that data actionable and useful and motivational for occupants. And my role at Lucid as Director of Engagement is to help customers who are mostly commercial office spaces, institutions, civic governments, etc., utilize the data that's in their buildings and utilize the building dashboard software for sort of creative ways to save resources and motivate their occupants and constituents. So it's a pretty fun sort of position, and Lucid over the last 7 years has expanded pretty dramatically. So we're now in 200 plus organizations in thousands of buildings across North America.
Sounds like you've grown quite a bit over the last few years. That's fantastic. So now, something that's often discussed within energy management is the dilemma between tenants and green buildings. Since occupiers are not always necessarily paying the costs, engaging tenants in creating low energy environments can be quite difficult. Do you have any practical tips on how to engage building occupiers on saving energy?
That's a good question, and I think oftentimes we start with the idea of cost. We start with the idea that if people know the cost of things or pay the cost of things, they're more likely to save that. And I think what the sort of behavioral research has found especially within energy, but within resources in general, is that there is not a whole lot of connection between what things cost necessarily for the users and consumption. And since generally speaking, energy is so undervalued as a resource and costs fairly small amounts for what it is, that we're going to motivate people just with with cost alone is not really the approach that has been most effective or found to be most effective. And so there's been this sort of growing body of research now that talks about how to create behavior change around energy and water usage, and that's really about social norming and creating a context by which occupants or homeowners or whomever else have an idea about how much they're using compared to their peers, their neighbors, whether it's their coworkers or someone else that they feel kinship with. If they have a sense of how much energy they're using compared to those groups, they're much more likely to conserve. And so by providing information that is both real-time, i.e., information that, as people take actions, they see the influence of those actions or the impacts of those actions, but also is presented in a way that, it has a context to it. So let's say you're in a commercial building and your office is using, X kilowatt hours, but your neighbor or someone else in a different department or someone else, who you're associated with in the company is using 20% less, and you have that information readily available, you're much more likely to change your behavior just through some of those simple cues. So Lucid really strives to make energy information, highly visible and easily understandable, and as real time as possible. So the feedback is happening as people are changing their behaviors, and then also normative. So that it's in the context of how you're doing with a peer group. In terms of practical tips, things you can do to get people to save energy, we found sort of all manner of behavioral interventions can be effective, and those can be anything from, helping people set budgets to helping people host competitions to getting people to make commitments to taking certain actions and making sure that those commitments are public and that those commitments are viewed by their peers. People are much more likely to follow through on actions that they've committed to if others know that they've made them. So, there are some ways to change occupant behavior. Using energy information and then using sort of a normative context, and even fun simple things, providing prizes for let's say the office space or the floor or the building within an organization that is able to reduce the most energy over a certain time period or stick to a budget. And we've seen prizes and motivation of all kinds of things. They don't have to be costly things. They can be really simple things like dinner with the president or access to something special or a special event, and that those end up being really motivational for people and become fun too, and become sort of part of the culture of the organization.
Now, one of the big questions usually is control. From your experience, how much control should occupiers have? Is it better to restrict their ability to directly change temperature, etc., or do you feel more that we should engage and educate them?
That's a really good question, and one that I think is still fairly debated. And we've certainly seen within the high-performance building world, within the green building world, a big shift over the last 10 years towards automation and central controls, lighting controls that are on occupancy sensors, and temperature that's on CO2 sensors and temperature sensors, and highly sophisticated sensing within buildings. But the flip side of that coin is that we've moved away from a place where tenants, occupants, homeowners, etc., have any control or any idea what's happening with those building systems or have any idea about how to change them. And so they're going to continue to go around with their sort of daily lives as they would. If that means it's too hot or too cold in their space, and everything is on automated sensors, they're much more likely to open a window if it's too hot, or to bring a space heater if it's too cold for them. If they have a sense that that the temperature within their space, that the hot and coldness is controllable by themselves, they're much more likely to go ahead and change it or request that it be changed. So I think for each different resource, whether it's lighting or HVAC or plugs, the answer might be a little bit different. We've seen some really exciting things in automated lighting controls where you have office spaces, especially commercial office spaces, where you have big areas of unlit space, but with really good controls over movement sensors, let's say, you can dramatically reduce a lighting electricity load. And those don't have to be controlled by occupants. But I think it's important to always give occupants an override, to give people a switch to turn on or off. And then, for HVAC, certainly the same. Having space controls and having, engagement with people around, it's going to be hot out today. You should wear a short sleeve shirt to work. We're going to leave the windows open, and this is why. And if it's too hot, we're going to, if you need to turn the air on a little bit, we're going to set limits to how much you can do that. So I think it really should be a combination. You're going to find a sweet spot. I think the pendulum has shifted too far towards automation and centralized control, and not enough in terms of tenant and occupant engagement and controls. And so you see the super high performance green buildings with atrium lights on all the time with no manual switch to turn them off. And you have occupancy sensors that may be working or only partially working, and now you're wasting electricity all over the place. And so, you really do need, I think, a combination of both, empowered occupants and smart controls.
So I think you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. There's this concept of gamification. Could you explain that a bit further for us?
Sure. So gamification is the sort of idea that you can, turn this information about your building, electricity consumption, HVAC consumption, water consumption, etc., and turn it into something that is information that is accessible, that is fun to interact with, and that is, truly interactive. That leads occupants or leads consumers through a process by which they learn something about the data, that they take action around the data, and that they're, then willing to change, basically. And so the example that is sort of given fairly regularly, or the one that we employ regularly, is around resource reduction competitions, and these we found have been a really effective way to, in essence, sort of gamify the process of saving energy. And energy efficiency typically has gotten sort of a black mark, and sort of dull and boring and so forth. But we're sort of seeing confluence of events. The cost of energy going up, budgets being tightened, and better information being available about what's being used and where and when. And so we found that we can really create fun contexts, energy competitions being a great example, to motivate people to conserve resources. Just one example, we work with some big commercial office spaces in the United States with Google and Yahoo and some other sort of commercial tech firms like those, and they've employed energy conservation competitions in their office spaces, focusing just on plug loads. So this is just electricity consumed by plugs and receptacles. And they found that they can save something like 10% of electricity, total building electricity, by engaging occupants during a competition to change the behaviors around those receptacles and plugs. And so those are things like turning off computers at night when you leave, and unused or shared office equipment, lights and anything else that you plug in. And increasingly, as buildings become more efficient in the HVAC and lighting departments and the envelope departments, the percentage of total building electricity that is discretionary load, that is the load that the occupants control, what they plug in and use, continues to increase. And we found that it's something like 50% of total building electricity is consumed by plugs. And so these office spaces, by focusing during competitions on behaviors around those discretionary loads, those plugs and lights and so forth, desk lights, can save a considerable amount of electricity and money doing it. So that's just sort of one way that you can turn conservation into somewhat of a game with prizes and motivation and ranks and teams and so forth. But there are lots of others too.
So finally, do you have any last notes for us?
Last steps. It depends on who you are. I mean, if you're a building manager, if you're an energy manager, if you're someone in a commercial space or in a business that is using a lot of electricity or using a lot of resources in buildings, I would say you can't change what you don't monitor. And so the first step is to make sure you're measuring as real time as you can resource use in your spaces. And just by doing that, there's been found to be something like a 1% resource reduction just by the act of monitoring those streams. And you're going to see savings just by doing that. But that's just the first step. But there's a whole lot of other things you can do using really high interval data on buildings. And so I would say start with really good monitoring and going through the process. And sometimes it can be challenging to get the equipment installed to monitor those resources. But make the investment and start to look for ways to turn that investment in monitoring into savings and revenue potentially through other energy services.
That's some really great stuff, really insightful on a pretty difficult topic. Well, that's about all the time we have today. I'd like to thank Andrew for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. I appreciate it.
And thanks to our members for tuning in. Until next time.